Hey, this is Michelle, and welcome back to the Canadian History, a Chronology channel. Today's episode, number 25, is about Canada's relationship to the American Revolution. This will be part 1, as there is a lot to cover in this topic. Now, before we start, let's take a quick moment to review what we saw and heard in the last episode. We learned that France signed away its empire to the British on February 10, 1763, with its endorsement of the 1763 Treaty of Paris, and that France ceded Canada, French Acadia, any claim to the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes, and French Louisiana. We also learned that the English landed themselves in a 2-year war with the First Nations peoples, and that the Royal Proclamation created the province of Quebec and the province of Nova Scotia. The Royal Proclamation also tried to create a defined approach to native lands that troubles all of us, both First Nations peoples and non-natives, to this day. Okay, now we're ready to start this episode on the American Revolution, Part 1. An interesting way at looking at this is by thinking of the conquest of New France as being about French-Canadian history, and that by looking at the American Revolution as being about English-Canadian history. In the end, with the help of their former enemy, France, the British 13 colonies on the eastern shores of North America break free and form a new country, the United States of America. But hey, I'm getting ahead of the story here. Let's start at the beginning. The war with France had pushed Great Britain to near financial ruin, so Great Britain figured that the American colonies should chip in and help out. Sounded reasonable, but the colonies didn't enjoy full British citizenship and had no delegates in London, so why should they pay taxes, or even more taxes? Great Britain was denounced by the American colonialists as being a tyrant. Also at this time, Great Britain decided to review its policies regarding the French Canadians. It didn't want a war on two fronts. Britain needed to keep the French Canadians happy while she dealt with the Americans. In 1766, Governor Murray was replaced by Guy Carleton. This was not great for the English-speaking merchants of Montreal because Carleton continued on the path set earlier by Murray. Carleton spent 4 years back in London trying to convince Britain to restructure the governmental framework of Quebec. He figured that with the American colonies about ready to erupt, Britain needed to ensure that the French Canadians were happy with how things were operating, else they support the Americans. Carleton won his arguments, so the Quebec Act of 1774 revoked most of the Royal Proclamation of 1763. The Canadian colony would now be administered directly by the governor and a hand-picked council, but one that would include French Canadians this time. Of course, the English merchants were outraged at losing out on this point, but Carleton calmed them down by expanding the territorial boundaries of the colony. The Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes were given back to Quebec, and this brought much more territory to the fur trade. Key points of the 1774 Quebec Act included 1. French civil law for matters of property. 2. English law for criminal matters. 3. The seigneurial system of land management was confirmed. 4. And the Roman Catholic Church was given rights not allowed in Britain, including the right to raise money. It was a massive compromise, a mix of French customs and English business, a very Canadian approach. But oddly enough, this really enraged the American colonialists. They thought that Carleton had pretty much reinstated New France. In 1775, the American colonies held their Continental Congress to decide on a strategy to deal with Great Britain. They drew up a list they called the Intolerable Acts committed by the British, and at the top of this list was the 1774 Quebec Act. The Canadians were actually invited to the Continental Congress, but refused to attend. It wasn't because the Canadians were loyal to Great Britain, but it was because they didn't trust the Americans. Basically, the English Canadians were pretty happy with the territory expansion of the Quebec Act in support of their fur trade, so they decided to remain neutral. For the French Canadians, their clergy, the Catholic Church, and their seigneurs urged them to reject the call to join the American Revolution. They were worried about what would happen to the French-Canadian culture under the Americans. The Americans had clearly denounced the Catholic Church and French law in their call for a revolution against Great Britain, so the French Canadians too rejected the call to the battle. So the Americans did not get the support of Canadians, nor would Carleton. He figured because of what he had achieved with the 1774 Quebec Act that the Canadians would rally to the side of Great Britain. He too was to be disappointed. Well, that's it for our first look at the American Revolution, Part 1. Let's summarize. We learned that a historical view could be taken that sees the conquest of New France as being about French-Canadian history, while the American Revolution can be seen as being about English-Canadian history. That the 1774 Quebec Act was enacted by Great Britain in order to appease the Canadians so that Britain could concentrate their efforts on the American colonies who were seeking to rebel. Then in 1775, the American colonies held their Continental Congress to decide on a path to deal with Great Britain, and that the Canadians chose not to attend. Now, please stay tuned for the next episode, episode 26, where we jump into the American Revolution Part 2 and its continued impacts on Canada. In this episode, we'll look into the 1775 invasion of Canada. Now remember, at any time, feel free to leave comments or questions below, and I'll do my best to respond to them all. And please, be a Canadian and be polite. And if you like this content, please subscribe to my channel and give it a thumbs up. And hit the bell if you'd like to be notified of any new content. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.